Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for joining us today for this Management and Admin T-Level Core Component Assessment webinar. We are trialling Microsoft Teams today for the first time, using it as a webinar function rather than our normal go-to meeting platform. We are also working remotely, and so please do bear with us if there is any other background noise around. The webinar is being recorded, and so you will have an opportunity to get a copy of the webinar at a later date and to share with colleagues. Before we start, can anybody please type into the questions and answers section, please, to make sure that you can hear me. There's no questions as of yet. If somebody could please just type in to say you can hear, that would be fantastic before we start. I can see Robert's got his hand up, which means he must be able to hear. Bear with me. Robert, you're now allowed to speak. Could you confirm that you can speak hear us, please? I'm just taking you off mic. If you could unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, Dom, I can hear you clearly.
Perfect.
But we can't actually perhaps type in the chat box at the moment. That might be the
chat function is disabled.
Oh, okay.
It's just
sorry.
the question and answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Then fine. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Robert. Appreciate
Cheers.
it. Okay, so people are coming into the webinar via the lobby, so please bear with me as I let people in. Again, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. We will be looking at the T-level theory exam part of the assessment. Next slide, please, Ali. Thank you. So we are trialing the Teams webinar platform today, as I mentioned previously, for those that were slightly late. Please be aware that the chat function is not available today. However, the question and answers function is available. So if you have any questions at all during the webinar, please do pop them into the Q&A section, and we will do our very best to answer them today. Of course, usual practice, if we can't answer them today, what we will do is get back to you with responses by a frequently asked questions document. All attendees will be set to mute, and of course you will get a copy of the recording at a later stage. Next slide, please, Ali. Thank you. So just to introduce the team, my name is Dom Green. I'm Technical Advisor for Business Skills at City and Guilds. The T-level Management and Admin falls under my remit, as well as Karen's. So Karen is the Technical Advisor for Leadership and Management, and so as a keen interest with the second year occupational specialism, which obviously has an option of the Leadership and Management specialism. And I'm also joined today by Alison Whittle. Alison is our Technical Advisor for the post-16 sector, and Alison does a lot of work with our HEIs. Next slide, please, Ali. Thank you. So a brief look at the agenda before we start. We're going to do a brief overview of the core theory exams, look at the assessment objectives before looking at command verbs and question types, where we will try and break down some of those questions. And then we will look at hints and tips before hopefully having sufficient time at the end to answer your questions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass over to Alison, who's going to look at the TQ core theory exam in a little bit more detail. Thanks, Ali.
Thanks, Dom. Can you hear me okay there?
Perfect.
Oh, that's good then. That means everybody else can, hopefully. So just to sort of set the scene, really, and the main purpose of this webinar is to support delivery staff in preparing their learners or your learners for the theory exam component of the T-level technical qualification. And I think, you know, one of the biggest changes is teaching to a syllabus and having these end external assessments or exams, just as there are in A-levels and GCSEs. Now, there is a lot of information provided, which we've broken down into digestible chunks. But just to be clear, this webinar is aimed at centres who have started delivering this September and are preparing for their theory exams in this summer series. So just for the going into it in some detail, just to make sure that we get everybody on the same page. So for the core theory exam, learners must complete 2 externally set and externally marked exam papers covering knowledge from the management and administration core. Each of the papers has a weighting of 30%, making a total of a 60% weighting of the overall core assessment for the theory exam. The component is awarded on a grading scale of A star to E. So a little bit more detail there. We're not focusing on the employer set project today, so it's not that we're ignoring it, it's just that we have done a very deep dive into that particular part of the core assessment previously. So each paper, just to unpick some of the details here for you. So each paper will follow the same structure and it is in 2 parts. So there'll be a part A and a part B. Both of the papers are 2.5 hours long each, and both have a possible 100 marks for each of the papers. So looking at some of the detail in the exam papers here, I'm just going to start with paper 1. So part A of paper 1 has 55 marks available in total of that section, and that's going to remain the same for each series. And those 55 marks are going to be made up typically of 17 short and medium type answer questions that have between sort of, well, what we call low and medium tariff marks, ranging from 1 mark to 4 marks for each of the questions. And as we said, this is weighted to 55% of the overall paper marks. So part B has 45 marks, and that has 4 extended response questions, and that's weighted at 45% of the exam paper. Both core papers follow exactly the same structure, but each core paper is going to cover different technical content. Now, at the bottom of the page, you can see the focus and the content that is going to be in each of those papers. So what is important to understand is that both exams are profiled. In other words, the level of difficulty will increase through the paper, starting with those lower demand questions at the beginning of the question paper to the higher demand questions towards the end of the question paper. So, for example, in section A, the questions are going to start with basic demonstration of recall and understanding. And this, as you will see as we move through the presentation, is a assessment objective 1. And the reason for this is to give those learners a settling start to the assessment. The papers are then broadly going to build in demand, and they're going to include questions that require learners to apply their knowledge and understanding, which is going to be assessment objective 2. So what's in paper 1? Well, you can see the content covered in paper 1 relates to the underpinning knowledge outcomes of 1, 2 and 7, which are business context, people and business behaviours. So these, just to be really clear, these are the titles that are in the core of the management and admin. And the numbers highlighted in yellow refer to the UPK, the underpinning knowledge title or topic, and do not relate in any way to the number of questions in the topic. So for paper 1, anything that will be in that paper will be drawn from the content of those 3 topics or those 3 underpinning knowledge outcomes. Let's have a look at paper 2 now. So in paper 2, it's exactly the same setup really. That part A is 55% weighted, and it's made up of Again, 55 marks, and that again has 17 short and medium answer questions, which again, very similar, low tariff and medium tariff value. And they will target the knowledge to begin with, the recall, moving on to demonstration of understanding and application of knowledge. Whereas part B again will have 45 marks, 45% of the paper, and that will have 4 extended response questions, which are again going to target the application of knowledge, understanding, analysis and evaluation of information and issues. So the questions in the exam, or the content, are going to be based on the other 4 underpinning knowledge content that are 3, 4, 5 and 6. So you can see they're highlighted in yellow. Paper 2 is only going to be drawn from the content of those 4 UPK titles in the qualification handbook. And they do not relate to the number of questions they're highlighting. It's the number within the core. So the weighting and the marks are going to be staying the same for each exam series. So you almost know that there's always going to be, between, approximately 17, 18 short, medium type answer questions, and there's always going to be 4 extended response questions in each of those papers. Just to sort of let you know that exam paper 2, it will be released approximately a week after exam paper 1. So there's a week in between. They are not released together. So what I've done with this one here is I'm just going to move on to the next one. So this slide here is showing some of the timelines for the first theory exam core assessments in 2023. And you can see I've highlighted in yellow the when those exams and the timings of them will take place. So in June, exam paper 1 will be on the 6th of June, and it will be taken in the morning between 9:30 and 12, followed a week later by the 13th of June. Again, it's a morning exam, 9:30 to 12. If you look on the right hand side, you can see the autumn series has also been included with the dates for 2023. So should people decide they want to retake or sit for the first time, even, those dates are there for exam paper 1. Again, they're both morning exams, 28th of November or the 5th of December. They will be different exams, obviously, because it'll be a different exam series. So that's just a sort of, and they will be published again in advance every academic year. So we're just going to move on really to the next section, and that is going to be looking at the command verbs in relation to the types of questions and understanding those assessment objectives in relation to what questions are going to be asked within the theory exam. Now, I have revisited some of the slides that we've delivered in the high-level overview of the core assessments. And the reason I've done this is to recap, as we are aware there was a huge amount of information delivered in the high-level one, and not everybody attended a London or a Leeds session where we went through things again. And of course, the aim of this session really is to ensure that you have all of the information that you need to be able to support your learners in preparation for these theory exams. So, command verbs, as we know, they're the words and phrases that are commonly used in exams or assessment tasks that are to tell the learners how they should answer the question. Now, it is really important that learners are trained to recognise and respond to the different command verbs, as it tells them the level and depth of response that the examiner is going to be looking for. Now, this infographic is a very basic one that you can use to get your learners used to the different command verbs and meanings. So there's just an introductory slide really for those learners that possibly may not be used to this particular assessment strategy. So to really do a deep dive, really. So in this presentation, I'm going to be going through the core theory, as I say, the assessments, and looking at how the use of command verbs and question types are in the exams. And I think it's fair to say it's key that it's vital to understand the relationship between the assessment objectives and their weightings in relation to those types of questions and marks that are going to be allocated to those question types. Now, the next few slides are going to provide more detail of the relationship between those assessment objectives and question types, along with the marks allocated to each of those command verbs and AO's assessment objectives. But there is an expectation that learners will understand the language and terminology in the qualification handbook, as this is a level 3 qualification and it has been validated by employers and our industry boards. There's also, to let you know, a teaching and learning and assessment guide available on the website that has all this information in, but this session is really more about bringing the core assessments to life with some practical support and some nuggets of information to share best practice, as we are aware you are all experienced teachers. So this is what this looks like in the qualification handbook. So it's quite a lot to take in. So what I've done is break it down into those key areas that you can share with learners, because I'm not sure a learner would enjoy reading the depth of content that's on this slide. So moving on to this one, in preparation for those learners to be able to achieve the more demanding questions, I think it's fair that the main teaching focus probably is going to be firstly in ensuring security of that underlying knowledge, and then being able to demonstrate and give learners the opportunity to experience the relationship between facts and concepts in sort of relevant context. So you'll notice there are only 3 assessment objectives that are used in the core theory exams. So, they've been developed by Ofqual and IFATE across all of the technical qualification core assessments. And these assessment objectives are AO1, AO2 and AO3. And you can see straight away that AO1 has been broken down further to AO1A and AO1B. And if you look at the weighting of each of the AOs, you can see the percentage of marks that are going to be allocated to each of those AOs. So I'm just going to see if I can move that slightly. Yeah, that's perfect. So for AO1, the key task here is basic recall, and that is weighted at 10% of that theory exam. AOB is sort of a little bit more of being able to explain the principles and concepts beyond recall. So basically they'll build connections between some knowledge, and it's all about being able to summarize or explain, and that's going to be 20% weighted. So if you add AO1 and AOB together, 30% of all of the exam is going to be on those, what I call sort of low to medium type tariff questions. If we move on to AO2, you will be able to see that it's a little bit different. It's about applying knowledge and understanding, and it's always going to be weighted at the highest because it's an Ofqual requirement that AO2 is weighted as the highest across, which is application knowledge and understanding. 40% of the questions will be applied to this assessment objective. Moving on to AO3, you can see this is the hierarchy skills of analysis, evaluate, proposing, predicting, considering a response, looking at work-related problems, and that is weighted at 30% of the whole of the exam content. And of course, maths and English are going to be assessed specifically targeted via questions in paper 2 for the maths, and English skills are going to be assessed through the quality of the written response in section B of both papers 1 and 2. So they're the extended response questions where the English skills are going to be assessed. I know that's an awful lot of information, and I know you may probably play this back just to sort of make sure that you've digested all this information. But just to sort of break it down even further, really, because I know this used to help me when I was teaching. And it was on this slide, I've broken down AO1 to AO1A and AO1B. So if we start from the first column on the left-hand side, that's what we call the assessment objective. So it's about demonstrating knowledge for AO1B, demonstrating understanding for demonstrating knowledge for AO1A, demonstrate understanding for AO1B. If you move along to the second column, there's a brief description of what that assessment objective just is asking for. So it's basic recall, and AO1B is about explain. If we move on to the third column, it shows the weighting percentage of each of those assessment objectives for the theory exam. So we've already discussed that. We know it's between the both AO1 and A and B, it's going to be a total of 30% weighted across both of those exam papers. The fourth column is giving you an indication of the typical tariff or the marks that are going to be allocated to those assessment objectives. So in other words, AO1 is going to be those short, lower tariff marks, typically, you know, a separate point, a separate mark for each particular point, depending on how many points the question asks for. Give 2, you know, name 2, list 2, so there'll be obviously a mark for each of those points. And if we move on to AO1B, you can see that it tends to have, these are the questions that can be split into 2, and they may require a little bit more information, so therefore they may have slightly more marks allocated to that. So the fifth column provides some typical questions or tasks that are associated with each of those assessment objectives. I'm not going to be reading all these out because I know that you can see. So what it's saying is that, you know, AO1A is more about rote, really. It's all about, you know, being able to recall and state something that they've learned by rote. In other words, like labeling and sort of recognizing a fact, recalling a particular process or a procedure. And the same as AO1B is a little bit more, it's asking for an explanation of that and normally a question related to it. And you can see on the very final column there, which is the last column, there's a list there of typical command verbs that are used against each of those assessment objectives. And these are the types of questions that learners generally perform better on. So that's just broken that down a lot more, so you can share this, you know, with your learners. I've done exactly the same for assessment objective A2A, which is about application of knowledge and understanding. And therefore, you know, you can go exactly the same along each one. So that's all about your description. It's about applying that knowledge and understanding to specific situations. It's weighted at 40%. The typical tariffs are medium, so these can be between sort of 4 and 8 marks sometimes, depending on the level of questioning. And then these are the types of questions that you might be asked. So it's very much about explanation. And then, of course, the typical command verbs that are likely to be used with that particular assessment objective. So moving on to the final assessment objective, which is AO3. Again, I've followed the same format and broken it down. And this is the weighting of 30%, and this tends to be associated with the extended response type questions, which we mentioned earlier on. There will be 4 in each of the papers, and these are part B in paper 1 and part B in paper 2, and they are normally associated with AO2 or AO3. And Dom's got examples of these types of questions as we move through. So these are normally sort of your higher tariff ones. In other words, they will normally be marked against a level of marking response, in other words, banding. So these type of questions won't be, they'll be banded and put down particular sort of I think there is a demonstration of this further on. And of course, it's more about analysing, evaluating, justifying, and it's all about those hierarchy and being able to discuss, which is something that learners don't always understand how to put into on a written context. They can discuss verbally. The skill within this one is discussing something in a written context. So I think I mentioned earlier on that both of these theory papers are profiled on these AOs. So in other words, your learners are going to get all of those AO1 questions first, followed by AO2, and then they're going to finish on the AO3 again, the big questions at the end of the paper. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these next two slides, as we had included them in all our previous presentations, but it's just a quick table you can use to support your learners in understanding and responding to the different command verbs. And I think what is key is that for some learners, you know, they may not have taken any actual exams for 2 years. So it's important to reintroduce these skills as early as possible. So, you know, you've got the added sort of task really of reteaching those exam technique skills that are normally taught in schools and colleges before they join further education. So again, it's just to start again and just make sure that they understand those particular command verbs. I've listed them all in order: AO1, AO1B, AO2 and AO3. So I'm not going to spend any time for that. So it's just basically you can take this away and start using some of these command verbs when you're looking at some formative assessments there. So I think at this stage, I'm going to be handing over to Dom, who's going to show you what this looks like in practice, what I've talked about. So over to you, Dom.
Thanks, Ali. Appreciate it. Okay, so if we could have the next slide, please. So just to recap then, like Alison mentioned previously, paper 1 covers outcomes 1, 2 and 7, and paper 2 covers 3, 4, 5 and 6, and each paper consists of 2 sections, A and B. So what we're going to do is have a look at 3 questions from section A and a couple of questions from section B. Before we do that, what I want to briefly do is just show you the band table in how grading is done. So the section B is specifically around ERQ, so extended response questions, and of course it's the quality of those responses which is considered by the assessment team. So we need to make sure then that the quality of the written response when it's considered, when they are marked, is obviously in the top band where possible. So you can see from that guidance screenshot there, the different bands which will be looked at when assessing. And it's these descriptors in the mark schemes which will identify really the level or quality of the written response of the learner, which is expected to be seen. It's also really important to note that many of the ERQ questions cover various assessment objectives, like Alison mentioned. So you can see there in that example, it does cover AO2 and AO3, and there's a total maximum marks of 9. And you can see the breakdown there: AO2 3 marks, AO2 3 marks, and AO3 6 marks. So we're going to start now by looking at section A questions first. So if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So briefly then, question 3, identify one project management tool. So the key here is to ensure that the command verb is understood by the learner. Like Alison mentioned, it's really important to understand these command verbs. So it's identify, which essentially means recognize something and state what it is. So we can see that the acceptable answers are on the left. It's very straightforward. 1 mark for any acceptable answer on the left. Now, what's also important to note here is the comment in the guidance document, accept any other alternative answer that reflects a project management tool that visualizes a project. So even if a learner puts something different to those 4, apart from Pareto, then also that will be considered. And of course, there's just 1 mark there for an identify. So a pretty straightforward question for section A. Like Alison said, they will get harder as you go through. So question 9 then, also section A. An organisation that undertakes a significant amount of international trade is carrying out a PESTEL analysis. Explain the potential impacts of 2 political factors. So again, the command verb is explain, which is make clear or easy to understand by giving details and linked reasoning, linked to AO1B. So a learner there could look at potential impacts, potential political impacts. A perfect example would be international relationships, which may create red tape for imports, exports. We've had obviously quite a lot of recent evidence of that. Changes to the political situation, maybe a landscape that's changing in different countries or regions, which may impact demand for products. Which of course might reduce sales, it might increase sales. It might be that a change in government or general election, which could see support given or even removed for specific industry sectors. And of course, what's the impact to the organisation? So the introduction of government grants or subsidies, for instance, may open opportunities for a new product to be developed or even a new market. So essentially, any response like that, for each political factor identified, 1 mark will be awarded. So it's a maximum of 2 marks for there. So if a learner has explained 2 political factors, then 2 marks would be given for each one, and then it's a total of 4 in total. So obviously 2 explanations there in full would of the appropriate quality would give 4 marks. And again, it's not just the responses that I've read out there. The assessor will accept alternative responses that will still explain the impact of political factors. So moving on. Now, as I mentioned previously about maths would be targeted or assessed in paper 2 only. And of course, that directly links nicely to finance being knowledge outcome 4. So paper 2 is looking at 3, 4, 5 and 6. Hence why maths is assessed in paper 2. So it's still falling under section A. So calculate the gross profit margin for the management board. Express your answer as a percentage. So the command verb is obviously calculate. So a learner obviously has to work out the answer to a problem using the appropriate mathematical operators and concepts, which is directly linked to AO1B. So the guidance again is saying that 1 mark is for the correct formula and 1 mark for the correct calculation. So even so there is some knock-on marking there. So it does allow for 2 marks in total, and obviously directly linking to maths. Now, what we're going to look at now is the section B. So if we could have the next slide, please, Ali. Thank you. So these are slightly more complex, obviously, because they are higher weighted. So we can see at the top the scenario: an accountancy organisation recently visited by external auditors. Organisation replaced a number of staff. Key staff unavailable at the audit. So a bit of an issue there following the audit, and the organisation was just to be non-compliant. So what's the key information here? Well, the question is saying evaluate the potential improvements that the organisation can make, making a justified recommendation for those that the organisation should adopt. So we need to break that question down. So the question has 3 key areas. The first key area is what are the risks of non-compliance? So there needs to be an understanding of the risks of non-compliance. What are the potential improvements the organisation can make? and what's the justification for the learner's answer. So if we're looking at the top mark bands, a learner would apply a comprehensive understanding of the risks to the organisation of a non-compliant audit. They would demonstrate comprehensive use of analysis of the different types of improvements that the organisation could adopt. So obviously they need to be fully aware of that. Comprehensive evaluative skills, because it is asking the learner to evaluate. So evaluative skills when recommending those improvements. Recommendations obviously need to be presented with excellent, balanced and considered justifications. Basically how they will impact future improvements to reduce the main risks associated to non-compliance. And of course, because English is assessed as well, the response needs to be fully coherent and it needs to be articulated essentially with perfect structure to get the top band marks. And of course, that is a 12-mark question covering AO2 and AO3. Okay, if we'll have a look at the next question, please, Alan. So this is a small manufacturing company, has increased sales. The board's exploring a range of different short and long-term approaches they could use in order to respond to that situation. Again, breaking down the question, evaluate the different short and long-term approaches that are available to the board, and then making a recommendation to what to do next. So the question again has three key areas to consider. What short-term approaches can be taken, what long-term approaches can be taken, and what's the justification for that. And it's referencing AO2, apply knowledge and understanding to different situations and contexts, and it's referencing AO3, so analyze and evaluate information and issues. And it's got 12 marks available again, so 4 marks for AO2 and 8 marks for AO3. So to achieve a top evidence in the top band, a learner needs to apply, again, a comprehensive understanding of how the different approaches can be considered, how they'd support that organisation. They'll need to demonstrate the use of analysis of the different range of approaches available. So note there that it's the range of approaches here, so it's plural, and they need to obviously respond to the scenario with a range of approaches. They need to demonstrate a comprehensive evaluative skills again when looking at those different approaches that they've discussed, and they need to make a recommendation as far as what is a suitable course of action. Again, it needs to have detailed and accurate level of reasoning behind it, and of course that response again needs to be fully coherent. So the indicative content for this is, for the short-term approaches, suggests that the learner could validate the increase in demand and ensure it's not a one-off. So making sure that it's not a flash in the pan kind of situation. They'd need to then look at how the board can manage current production volumes to meet that current demand. The learner could suggest to review, prioritise existing workforce, such as identifying opportunities to maybe redeploy staff, maybe increase work hours, overtime, maybe reduce other activities within the business that staff are working on, and focus their attention on other specific areas linked to volume or the high demand that they are receiving at the moment. Now, long-term opportunities could be to discuss increased automation. Again, they would need to justify their recommendations. So, for example, what are the benefits of increasing the sales team, production, how effective is their short-term approach, how long will it last in supporting, say, increase in production, for instance, impacts of bringing in, say, agency staff, etc. What are the risks involved in that? So any of this can be discussed, and of course it's the justification of what they've written down. So there are 4 of these ERQ questions in total in section B, and all are designed to stretch and challenge the learner. So as it says at the bottom there, for less able learners, you may need to break these ERQ questions down during formative assessment prior to the actual sitting of the core assessment, to ensure that what we do find often is that actually a learner will pick out the first task and forget the other two. So there's three key questions, three parts of that question there. A learner will pick out, say, the short term, maybe the long term as well, but they'll forget to justify what it is that they've picked out. So really try and break down the questions with them as far as exam techniques go during your formative assessment, during your prep for the actual live assessment. So those are 5 key areas there that we've looked at, and they are a mixture of papers 1 and 2. And you can find those sample questions on our website for you to use as practice exams. So what I'm going to do now is pass back to Alison, who's going to look at how the exams are marked and graded.
Thanks, Dom. So I'm just going to provide a little bit more information, really, because it has been asked, you know, how do you mark against three different assessments, really, for the core into one final grade, that is A star to E. So I've just tried to do this visually because it's obviously, anybody, you all know, it's certainly not a straightforward marking. It has to go through awarding, and we go through grading engine against uniform mark scale. So basically, I'm just going to bring it right down to sort of how it is. So the raw marks from paper 1 and paper 2 are combined together. So the raw marks are just those actual marks, and we know that for each of the management and admin, there's 100 marks in their exam. So there's a maximum of 100 marks in paper 1 and 100 marks in paper 2. So what happens is those marks are added together and they are set against a uniform mark scale before any of the grade boundaries have been set. So the same applies to the raw marks from the ESP, which are then put against a UMS before any of the grade boundaries are set, and then all three are aggregated to provide an overall grade for the core component, which is awarded, as you know, on a scale of A star to E, the same grading scale that is used for general qualifications. So what I've done to sort of break this down a little bit, because we are only talking about the theory exam today, I thought it might be helpful just to show you the grade boundaries from the Building Services Engineering's last summer exam series in 2022. I know it has absolutely nothing to do with business, but obviously we have no examples yet because nobody's sat the business papers. So I just wanted to show you how it worked out, really. So it gives you an idea of the range of marks, and for those papers. Now obviously you can see here, so it's a maximum of 110 because their paper was out of 110 marks each and not 100. So what has actually happened is this comes with a bit of a warning, really, a bit of a health warning, that generosity of grading was applied to this series due to COVID, and that is not going to be applied this year. And as you all know as teachers, that grade boundaries can change from year on year. And I used to say, as a good tip for teachers that I worked with, say always add 10% onto the last year's grade boundaries, as it's unlikely to ever go over that. And as we know, grade boundaries can go up as well as down. So the notional boundaries were applied to each of those papers. Those papers were added together to find the total raw marks. Then UMS, uniform mark scores, were applied for a grade using those mark ranges. And of course, generosity, as I mentioned before, of grading was applied to this, which is unlikely to happen again. But it just gives you an idea of the depth of marks and the sort of range of marks within an A was between 135 and 220, or 120, 134, and an E was sort of an E grade on the core papers was between 60 and 74 out of 200 and 10. So, it's quite sort of generous grading there. So I thought it might be helpful for you to show you how it was marked. So what I thought again might be really helpful in my final 2 slides before I hand over to Dom is I've provided some feedback that we've had from principal moderators. As I explained, it's not for the management and admin 2 level because we haven't actually had any exam principal moderators providing feedback yet. However, learners are the same wherever they are, and I just thought it would be worth sharing the comments with you from previous exams in previous sectors so you can help learners to avoid some of the common mistakes that were made on other papers. So these are the sort of commonalities across all of the wave 1 and wave 2 exams, and they said in the lower mark questions like AO1A and AO1B, all learners generally performed well on those types of questions. So, however, if we recall that that's only 30% of this particular of these papers. They said the majority of learners did attempt every question, which is really good. And they said right the way throughout, all learners tended to perform better in one of the papers. So analysing that slightly, I wonder if the best use was made over the UPK titles, or was everything taught? And then, it's an awful lot to take in the core rather than broken up and concentrated. So just another hint there. And the examiner said, what could be improved? So what they said is, the extended response questions, although learners did quite well, the reason they didn't get into the top bands was that they didn't remember to contextualize their answers to the question. So they answered the question, but it was very generic. They didn't actually contextualize their answers, as Don mentioned before. There was also I'm not sure how this would apply to management and admin, and I don't think it possibly will apply, but there was a lack of correct terminology for some learners. So I would imagine that tends to be when it's sort of very much an engineering type sort of qualification. So that may be why that was. What was evident is that learners had not read the questions properly. The examiners commented on the fact that, if it said what is the most or not, they hadn't actually read the questions thoroughly. They also said candidates found it challenging when having to respond to and follow question command verbs. They said that was quite apparent that they weren't used to that. And they said in some cases handwriting was so poor and in some cases illegible, which meant that even though the answer could be right, that the examiners weren't able to award marks because they actually couldn't read it. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that and then really focus on some top takeaways, really some hints and tips that you may not be aware of, really. So just to let you know that marks are given for acronyms and industry abbreviations, and they will give marks for workings out even if that end answer is incorrect, because they're looking for the process that learner has taken. What was apparent is that it seems that a lot of learners may have run out of time because it became quite apparent that they were rushed towards the end. And in the ERQ, some of those questions in the extended response weren't completed. So just a little hint here is do feel free to remind them of timings during the exam. It's perfectly acceptable to say, you should be moving on to, part B now. There is only so much time, or you've had half an hour, and a half an hour left to go. You should be moving. It's perfectly acceptable to do that when it's an invigilated exam. Another simple hint, make sure there's a clock on the wall that the learners can see, because they tend to use their mobile phones for time, and of course mobile phones aren't allowed in exam rooms. I would look at the delivery as well. It's really critical that the full coverage of the core is completed. And if it hasn't been completed, then there's nothing to stop you delaying your first exam series to be in the autumn to make sure that there is full coverage. definitely concentrate on AO2, assessment objective 2, application of knowledge and understanding, as it's got the highest weighting, as you know. And I think practice those two-part questions and answers when it's in one, because what they said is learners always attempted one but forgot to answer the second half of it. And if you've got learners that has really poor handwriting, you can use block letters or you can print the words. And I think, again, another key hint is only let them use a black or a blue ballpoint pen. A pencil does not show up, and a felt pen bleeds through the papers, so it actually goes on to the next page. So simple hints there. So no felt pens or pencils. I mean, this can be slightly contentious. I understand that the amount of white space provided after the question is an indication of the level of response learners should provide. It is by no means set in stone, but it is to give that learner the best possible chance by understanding that it's more than a one word or the level of response, to make sure that that learner has an idea, particularly if there's one command verb that may be used in different ways. You know, so it's very much a case of just to give that learner an indication of what we're expecting. And of course, a lot of learners when asked to explain tended to describe, and that's maybe something you could focus some time on with learners, that the difference between an explain question is obviously going to require a higher level of response than simply a describe question, rather than describe the effect of. So it's just making sure that those learners know. So the general conclusion of all of these were that there was a clear differentiation of performance within the cohort when candidates were asked to demonstrate that AO2 of understanding and application and AO3 analysis or evaluation. And it was also evident that candidates would benefit from support in developing their extended response answering techniques, as candidates underperformed across the waves, not in management and admin, as we say, in section B of these exams. And the biggest hint there is to get them to contextualize their answer to those questions. So I think that's my bit done. So I think I'm going to hand back to Dom now, who's going to take you through the final few slides. So thank you, Dom.
Thanks, Sally. So just to really reiterate how we support you from here on in. Obviously, up until now, we have been doing face-to-face networks, lots of webinars, etc. If you have missed any, you can look at the recordings on our website under the T-Level banner, events and webinars, and all our webinars are recorded and placed on there. So we will continue to provide networks and events throughout the year, and obviously throughout next year, with a heavy focus obviously on occupational specialisms. We have an e-bulletin that keeps providers up to date, so please do look out for that. And of course, we have all the resources on our website as well, including guide standard exemplification materials, which look at distinction and pass for the occupational specialisms, as well as a sample marking grid. So well worth preparing for year 2 by looking for those particular documents. And those can be found under the Management Administration qualifications page, so not the T-level page, the qualification page. And simply, if you type in 8715 into the search bar on our City and Guilds websites, that will take you to the Management and Admin qualification page itself. Next slide, please, Ali. So now is obviously moving towards the end of year 1. Tomorrow is the deadline for employer set project uploads. The window does shut tomorrow, and obviously there's a focus on preparing for the core exams, which is on the 6th of June and the 13th of June. You will be able to find a timeline of what's going to happen next year as well on the website. And of course, the resource hub as well has everything there to support you in prepping for that. If you are looking at offering open events, open days, open evenings, etc., if you're not aware, on the website there is also a T-Levels Learner Flyer, very good double-sided A4 brochure, which is particularly good for learners and parents, we quite often find that it's the parents that want to have the granular detail, and so that can be found on that link as well. And of course, ourselves are always available. Please feel free to drop us an email if you've got any further queries. Now, what we're going to do is in a couple of weeks, on the 22nd of May, we're going to do a bit of a Q&A follow-up to this. Now, it might not be that it's generating any questions at the moment. However, we will have an open session on the 22nd of May for 45 minutes, and basically a chance for you to come on. It won't be us presenting, but it will be a case of you being able to listen to other people's questions, or put your own into the question and answers section of Teams webinar. We'll read those out and answer them. So if you've got any questions that are not answered today, between now and the 22nd, obviously sign up to the webinar and pop it in there. Even if you don't have any questions, we'd recommend that you join, because it might be that you get some answers that you perhaps didn't think of from other people's questions as well. So to find out, to log on to register for that, again, it's on our events and webinars page on the City and Guilds website under T-Levels events and webinars. Sign up in exactly the same way as you did do for this particular webinar. Now, just a brief recap of what's available externally to City and Guilds. Industry placements guidance is available, introductions to T-Levels, how T-Levels are funded, and potentially capital funding as well. So it might be worthwhile having a look at that particular link for T-Levels capital funding to see if you can access any of that. Resources for teachers, next steps for providers, supporting with delivering T-Levels, and transition programs. So transition programs have perhaps had a slightly slower start this year, but for further information about the framework surrounding them, please do click on that link to get more information. And of course, the ETF, so the Education Training Foundation, also support with free development training, professional development training as well. So if you haven't got involved with the ETF, please take the time to click on the link. They do some great workshops, which also allow you to mingle, to mix, and to build relationships with other centres around you doing obviously the same T-level. And finally, the long-awaited textbook is now fully available. I have a copy in my hand as we speak. It is available actually from Amazon. I think it's about £32 or £33 if you want a hard copy, but you will be able to see there that there is a digital format as well. I've not seen the digital formats. It is produced by Hodder Education, but do feel free to go onto their website and have a look. And if you have any queries, contact Ruth Murphy at Hodder, and she'll be able to guide you further around the digital formats. I think the next slide gives a brief overview of what the book itself offers. So I particularly like the case studies and the assessment practice. They do kind of allow learners to contextualize scenarios, which is of course very good practice for the ESP, as well as extended response questions. And finally, T-level associate vacancies. Please do, if you are interested in becoming a moderator, a TQA or a principal examiner or a marker, please do keep an eye out for our T-level associate vacancies. They will highlight any vacancies that we have at the moment in T-levels, not only T-levels, other vacancies as well, but of course not just the M&A sector, management and admin sector, across all sectors. So it might be that you pass those details on to colleagues around your centre, your college, your sixth form, etc., in other areas, as there might well not be any vacancies in the management and admin, but there may well be vacancies elsewhere. So the beauty of working within the associate team for City and Guilds is obviously you will get an insight into how the core and the ESP are assessed, which you can then take back that valuable knowledge to your centre. So that brings us to an end, which is bang on 3 o'clock actually, which doesn't necessarily give us any time for questions. However, looking in the questions and answers section, I can't see any unanswered questions. Thank you to those who did say that you could hear fine. If you do have any questions, pop them in now. We'll try and address them. I am conscious of time, so we'll just give it a minute. And if you have any now, between now and the 22nd of May, you can contact us directly before that. However, please do join our next webinar, and we can address them then in that 45-minute session. Just a reminder, that won't be us presenting, that will be just an opportunity for you to pose questions to us and listen to others as well. So there's no questions come through. So I'd like to just thank you all very much indeed for joining us today. Much appreciated. And we don't be a stranger, keep in touch. You know where we are, and hopefully we will see you on the 22nd. Thanks again.
Dom, just before you
Yes.
go, I'm sorry, there are some questions I've just managed to find in the chat here.
In the chat?
Yeah, sorry, in the Q&A, I'm sorry.
Q&A?
Yeah, sorry. Have we got a minute just to, if those that
Oh
want to
yes,
stay
sorry,
on, is that
they have
okay?
updated, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I think it's been a while to update. I don't think it updates as you're presenting, that's all.
Right.
So the first one, I won't mention, well, we can see there, with candidates who have word processing as an exam requirement, are they able to write their long answers up on a computer? Yes, I would say absolutely, isn't it, Dom?
I would presume so. You would probably
Yeah.
need to go through our quality team to make sure that those adaptations have been logged.
Yeah.
You will obviously need to follow, presumably, it may be better to use a piece of hardware that hasn't got access to external resources such as the internet, for instance, for obvious reasons, and obviously saved work that might be on there. But I'm pretty sure that if you went through our quality team and asked the question, then the appropriate assistance will be offered as an alternative.
Just going back to William, yes, it is the tutor book, this that Dom was talking about before.
That's
wasn't
correct.
it? That is for the tutors.
Yeah.
Someone can't hear the sound. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I'm hoping that once you get the recording side, I think that you will be able to hear it then, because I don't think it's our issue. I think we're okay with that. Because thank you, Jill. Someone said she can hear fine, coming in loud and clear. I think that's it. Everything is done. I'm just looking at, yeah, that's all. I just didn't want to leave anything out, Dom. Is that okay? Is that all right? So
Absolutely fine. Thank
we've
you very
answered
much, Ali.
everything.
Okay, so once again, many thanks for joining today, and have a good rest of the week, and hopefully see you on the 22nd.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye. Thanks. Bye-bye.